This is your before and after story. Instead of imagining a rewarding career in medical imaging, Southeastern College can actually take you there. Prepare for a career in ultrasound, radiology, and X-ray technology with hands-on specialized training, simulations, and real-life experience with the latest imaging technology. You'll be ready to play a vital role on any healthcare team. Transform your life by helping others. Southeastern College. Your future is bright. Visit scc.edu to get started.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Calling Out Creatures. As most of you that listen in know, I am your host, Lori, and tonight I have a really good podcast. It is Batty for Bats, a dive into the weird and wonderful world of bats. And my guest tonight is Alyson Brokaw. She's a behavior ecologist and a bat scientist. And Alyson is going to impart all sorts of wisdom on us tonight about bats and hopefully dispel a few myths and stuff that are going around about them and give us some more information. And hopefully we'll all learn a little bit tonight. So, Alyson, thank you so much for being on the podcast tonight. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
It's great. Why don't you go ahead and just start out and tell us a little bit about yourself? I mean, what first inspired your passion for studying bats?
Sure. So, like you said, I'm a behavioral ecologist and bat scientist, which basically means for the behavioral ecology, I'm interested in why animals do the things they do, and particularly have been interested in bats. I grew up in sort of rural Pennsylvania, and we would frequently see bats out flying around in the evenings, especially in the summertime when we'd be out on our deck to have dinner. And my parents would always sort of point them out and be like, "Look, Mrs. Bat has come to join us for dinner." So I've always been surrounded by nature, always really loved seeing animals in the wild, and kind of knew from a pretty early age that I wanted to be a zoologist or a wildlife biologist. And then as I was going through, college, I just sort of started to learn about bats and just realized how much we still didn't really know about them, and how many sort of gaps and things there were still to discover in what we know about bats and why they do what they do, and just how many there are. And even after 10 plus years of studying bats, I'm still learning new things. My colleagues, we're all still always learning new things about bats, and it's just very exciting, and keeps us curious and interested.
I apologize for my dog in here barking. He's okay. I wasn't going to bring it up, but we're on the road and we're in an RV, and his people are in there eating while I'm doing my podcast, and he misses them. So you might hear a bark or a whine. I'm so sorry. Anyway, got that out of the way in case you guys hear him. So I hope y'all can put up with it. It's an animal podcast, everybody. So anyway, just letting you know, that's what the bark or the whine is. It's nothing bad or anything like that. He's just missing his peoples. So, okay, sorry. And I think it's really cool that you wanted to study bats, because so many people are afraid of bats, and all the myths and the misrepresentations and stuff about them. And so, I don't think as many people are interested in finding things out about them. So I'm glad that there are some researchers out there that are looking into bats and finding out all these really cool things about them. Was there actually a particular bat species or a field experience that made you want to write the book that you wrote, The Weird and Wonderful World of Bats, which we are going to talk a little bit about as well? What inspired your book?
Yeah, so I would say not necessarily anything in particular. I've definitely had, just in my research career, there's some of my favorite field experiences. We'll sidetrack, but one of my favorite species of bat is the wrinkle-faced bat, which I encourage your listeners to Google because they're very hard to just picture.
They look very strange.
Them in the book. They are aptly named. They're just so weird and strange, and I remember the first time I got to see one in person, and you're just like, what am I looking at? Well, as far as with the book, so I have been involved, particularly as I was in grad school, became really passionate about just sort of science communication in general and how we can, share all this, sometimes complicated and difficult to understand science with people who are not scientists or not scientists in our specific fields. And so I got really involved with sort of just talking about bats and just kind of realizing that, kind of as you say, so many people sort of have these misconceptions about them. Most people have never seen a bat up close. It's not something that we are usually encountering on our day-to-day lives. And so they're just sort of this mysterious, thing flying around in the night. And so being able to just sort of show people, like, here's what a bat looks like, here's this beautiful diversity of bats. And then particularly with COVID-19 and a lot of the discussions around sort of bats and diseases, I was approached by the publishers sort of saying, like, hey, would you be interested in writing this book about bats so that we can sort of show, all the good things about bats and kind of really talk about why they are special and unique and, that we don't need to be afraid of them and the things that we can learn from them, that bats can, tell us about life and evolution and immune systems and flight and all these fascinating things just about our world that we can learn from bats. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of the main impetus for sort of writing this book, and it was very fun to get to dive into all the things that I was familiar with, but also I was learning new things as well as I was diving into the various types of research around bats.
Well, I'll tell you, it's a really good book. I received a copy and I read through it, and there's so much information in this book about bats and all the different things, that you can possibly think of to know about them and the different species and varieties of bats. And the wrinkle-faced bat is definitely one you want to look up because they are very interesting looking. And the pictures, the photographs in the book are just so good. They're just beautiful pictures in the book. I just thought some of the ones, like where the bats were swooping down to get a drink of water and you could see the beads of water and stuff from where they were grabbing the water, it was so cool to see some of these photographs, you guys. So I highly recommend, if you want to know more about bats, you go get Alyson's book. It's well worth it. So, very good read.
Thank you.
So with that being said, what is the most surprising thing in your research that you have learned about bat census?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll sort of lead into this question by giving a little more background. So my main interest, besides sort of animal behavior, has been sensory biology, so how animals sort of use their senses. And my research has focused on how bats use their sense of smell. And so, we think about bats, echolocation as being this really important sense that bats are using. They're using sound to get around, which is hugely fascinating. And people, my colleagues and people who study bats, we're still figuring out exactly how bat brains process this complicated information and do it so quickly. And then my interests were in how bats use their sense of smell, but what actually I found really interesting when I was writing the book was also learning more about how bats see. So we've all heard the, blind as a bat sort of idioms, and just to sort of clear the air, all bats have eyes. They can all see. There are no blind bats, at least as far as we know. And they are actually fairly good at seeing. Some of them probably can see about as well as we can, maybe slightly better, particularly considering that they are using their vision in the dark. But there are also bats that can see into color spectrums that we humans cannot see. So we have some evidence that bats can see ultraviolet light, so kind of beyond blue into this sort of ultraviolet spectrum where a lot of insects tend to see colors. We see that maybe in our bats that are feeding on flowers. And that may actually be fairly more widespread than we imagine. And then, that they have these, they have so many of these specific types of receptors in their eyes that they're just so much better at seeing in the dark than humans are. Mm-hmm. So I just feel like that's something that we always, I don't know, humans, we're so visually oriented that it's confusing to us that animals can see in the dark. And so it turns out that bats are not so terrible at it.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, cats obviously see pretty well in the dark. I don't think horses see so well in the dark. But, yeah, there's quite a few different species of animals out there that see in the dark. And I would have imagined that bats would be able to see in the dark, considering they're out at night for the most part. So, yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. I know a lot of people, think about their echolocation, that, the sonars and sounds that they're sending out to, make sure they don't fly into things and, to find their insect prey and stuff like that. I think that's probably more so what people associate with bats than, of course, the sight, I guess. But
yeah, and it makes sense, too. So bats can see, but if you're trying to, you are flying at some relatively high speed trying to spot a very tiny insect that's also flying at a relatively high speed in the dark, it makes sense that sound is a much more reliable sense than vision. And so bats have gotten very, very good at using sound. Some bats can hear insects walking, essentially on leaves. Some bats they use the Doppler effect. So when you hear like an ambulance or like a police siren, how it sounds like it's going up and down in frequency.
Right.
That's actually a function of physics and the way that sound waves move. That the frequency of that sound is actually constant, but we hear it shift. And so bats can take advantage of essentially that phenomenon to make calculations about how fast an insect is moving and where it has moved to.
Oh, wow.
So it was this Doppler shift compensation, basically. So they are sending out a signal at one frequency, but their brains are tuned to hear a different frequency. And so they can be really specialized at which frequencies they can hear and how well they hear them. And different bats have different, they're tuned to these different frequencies depending on the type of prey that they're hunting or the echolocation sounds that they themselves are making. So they're all very specialized, which is great because it means we can eavesdrop on them and actually know what species are flying around just based on the sounds that they are making.
Oh, yeah. Well, so they have, excuse me, they have specific sounds to, is it specific to each individual like bat, or is it just specific to the variety of bat?
A little bit of both. So each individual species of bat has its own characteristic frequency that it makes its echolocation calls at, or a set of frequencies. So some bats are, they might start their echolocation call at one pitch and then they sort of slide down into a lower pitch over the course of the call. And we can now, using ultrasonic microphones, we can visualize these calls into what we call spectrograms, and visually, and then, using more complex computer sort of transformations and calculations, we can actually assign species to these calls. So different species have slightly different calls. And then there is also some evidence that bats themselves may be able to, have some individual flexibility. So the same way that, I can, pick up the phone and my mom is going to know that it's me on the phone because she recognizes my voice, bats are probably able to do some of the same things with the bats that they themselves are interacting with and kind of recognize, familiar voices.
Right. Well,
just
like
based on echolocation calls.
Right, like mom and babies.
Yep.
Because, so I know, and that was actually something I was going to. That was something I was actually going to ask you about. Was about you were talking about bats like singing or arguing. So is that kind of, something like that? And then, is that kind of like their communication, social behavior type of stuff? Or is it...
Yes. So the echolocation calls are separate from their social calls. So the echolocation calls are... They can vary, but they are pretty predictable within species. And if you think about what bats are using echolocation calls for, it's for a very specific reason. They're trying to detect an object or an insect or a tree. So those tend to stay relatively consistent. But then, just like pretty much every other mammal, almost every other animal, bats have this whole range of other sounds that they can make. So we call those collectively their social calls, and that's basically just any vocalization that isn't an echolocation call. And so, they can make all sorts of noises. If people have ever, been outside of a bat roost or been near a roost of bats, they can be very noisy. It's a lot of squeaking, a lot of sort of shrills and hissing. Those are all what we would call social calls. So that's the bats sort of interacting with each other, whether it's to say, like, hey, back off, you're in my spot, or, a mother trying to, find her pup after coming home from hunting. And then you mentioned the singing. So bats, so song, right? We think of that as being very human. There are only a few other mammals that we know of that produce songs as being defined as these, melodic changing of tone and sound. And so other animals that we know of that sing are whales, but then also bats. So there's actually several species of bats that produce these songs. Most of them are used for courtship. So these bats are the males are out there singing love songs to attract females. And then sometimes they also use songs the same way that birds do, as a way to sort of say, hey, this is my territory. If you are another male or another bat of a different social group, like, back off, this place is mine. So they're using songs in a lot of different ways, very similar to birds.
Okay. Well, that would make sense, I guess. And I know I was reading, like with the interactions and stuff that some bats have, like with the feeding and stuff like that they're kind of particular, sharing food and stuff like that.
So that was something that we sort of learned not that long ago, but they'll eavesdrop on each other. So if they, if I'm a bat out flying around at night and I hear another bat making what's called a feeding buzz, which is a specific variant of an echolocation call that usually indicates that a bat has tried to grab an insect. Pretty good indication that, they're actively hunting, actively feeding. I might be able to, if I'm this bat and I hear that, I might be like, that sounds like there's some good eating over there. Like, I'm going to head that way. And then they will sometimes, the Mexican free-tailed bats in particular, a species found in mostly southwestern and some western parts of the United States, they will produce a call that actually jams the echolocation calls of their fellow bats. So they'll
you ain't
like,
getting through for that bug.
Like, yeah, that's mine. So they've got there's a lot of complexity in the way that they interact with each other. Different species have some different things that they do. As far as we know, I think the free-tailed bats are the only ones that we know of that have these interference calls, but a lot of them have, a lot of different bats do song, a lot of different bats have some form of like a back-off call, like, get out of my face kind of call. So we can see similarities across the way that they interact with each other and, analogies to the way that we as humans interact with each other, which I always think is really interesting to sort of think about from a, evolutionary perspective and sort of how we can find ourselves in nature.
It's funny because I've been doing the podcast now for quite a few years, and it's amazing how many different animals have a lot of human qualities and mannerisms and stuff like that are being noticed by researchers. So, makes sense. What was I going to say about the... Darn it, now I lost my train of thought on that. Oh, well. Maybe I'll think about it or come back to me in a few minutes. I know what it was. I was just going to comment on the jamming for the echolocation thing that they do. I wonder if the military got the idea to do some of that stuff, with their military stuff from the bats doing it. Wouldn't that be interesting?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, there is some interest. It's a way that we can sort of interfere with sound. It's the same principles basically that bats are using.
That's interesting. I don't know. It just made me think about that. With some of the jamming stuff. So when it comes to, obviously, bats are going after insects and stuff like that. Birds also go after insects. So when it comes to a bat's flight abilities, how do those kind of compare to a bird or an insect's flight abilities? I mean, do they have a better, obviously they can get up to some pretty good speeds. I mean, do they have some pretty good turning radius and stuff at those speeds?
So again, it depends on the species, and I'm going to say that a lot because bats are just so diverse that with across a lot of these interesting things, it really just depends, which type of bat we're talking about.
I would imagine a smaller bat, like the small brown bat, obviously is probably going to have a little bit more maneuverability than, say, a bat, one of the fruit bats, especially since the fruit bat, eats fruit and really doesn't. I don't know if they eat insects too, but if they don't, then why would they really have as good of a maneuvering ability except for to miss, the trees and stuff like that when they're flying, I guess. So bats, just to kind of orient everybody. So bats are cool because when we think about their wings are basically hands. So that, that whole wing and all that membrane, all those big long bones, those are all these long finger bones that have elongated and then have the membrane, the skin between them. And that is interesting and special with bats because it means that a bat wing has a lot of flexibility. So if you think about just the way that we can move our fingers, we can move fingers individually. We can bend, some fingers, but not all of them. And so bats can do the same thing. And so that gives them a lot of control over the shape of their wing, which is going to, have implications for the way that they are interacting with the air as they are moving through the sky. And so they are if you watch a slow motion bat in flight, they kind of have this almost more of a scooping motion than a flapping motion that we associate with birds, where they're kind of, sort of swimming through the air almost if you slow it down enough. Okay, yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, so it gives them this a lot of flexibility, which is what helps them for many of these bats be so maneuverable. Because they can, they can change just a tiny part of their wing as opposed to having to move the whole wing to maybe adjust their positioning. How well they do that depends on, how long their wings are. So bats that have really broad, short wings tend to be better at maneuvering in tight spaces. That's what we see, the wing shapes we see in a lot of fruit bats. Particularly the smaller fruit bats. It's the types of wing shapes that we see in bats that live in dense forests. But then some bats have, these long, narrow wings. And so those types of bats, they're not quite as maneuverable, but they can move really fast in straight directions. So we tend to see that in more types of bats that are found, flying in open space, or that are migrating, where they need to be able to fly long distances and be energy efficient. We tend to see these long, narrow wings. So what's cool is you can sort of look at a bat's wing shape and sort of guess what sort of, behaviors it might be doing and where it might be living simply based on sort of the way their wings are shaped, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. I didn't realize that you could tell where they lived from the wing shape. That's interesting. So why do you think that bats, I can actually probably come up with a couple of these, why do you think bats have such a bad reputation, and what can we do to maybe change the public perception about bats? Like I said, I can think of a couple. I mean, you have Dracula, you have rabies, you have, and I mean, I love Halloween, but, bats, witches, Halloween, bats, stuff like that, it's all associated. So I can kind of understand, a little bit why they would have the bad reputation, I guess. But what's your opinion on that kind of stuff?
I mean, it's something I've thought about, and I'm not a social scientist, but I think there is sort of this element of, as humans, we are daytime animals. We are highly visual. We need to be able to see things. And so kind of any animal that is more active at night, which is a time frame, that we are already, evolutionarily designed to be a little bit more on edge and cautious for. And so, there's sort of this idea, any animal is sort of active at night that we can't really see. There's always going to be a little bit of sort of that, instinct to be a little bit cautious. And then I think just sort of fear of kind of unknown anything. And so, bats are not something that most people are interacting with regularly. And that is true for, across time. And I will also say that a lot of, what I tend to think of, and I think what you sort of mentioned in terms of our perceptions of bats, are very based in Western society. Other cultures have very different views of bats, and I think it just depends on the way that they've interacted with bats. Western society, European society, the sort of witches and the sort of association with nighttime, and then the links to religion, and to things like the devil and witches. That's sort of one set of culture, but then other cultures have very different relationships. Places. Yeah.
Asians, they're food, right? Asians, they're a food source?
Somewhat. I think it's not as common as we think it is.
I kind of was thinking about that. I was reading about it. I'm like, I don't know how common that is, but
yeah, I mean, it is something that it is a concern in terms of conservation, particularly for the flying foxes, just because they are these larger animals. And actually, most of the hunting that occurs for bats is less focused on hunting to eat them, and it's more about hunting to protect crops and those sorts of things.
Yep.
So and of course it depends on the culture. But yeah, I mean, different cultures, like, I think, again, it's just sort of this idea of the unknown, and then because there are so many different types of bats, and depending on where in the world you are, the types of bats you have are different, and so just that can also lead to a lot of confusion, and sort of uncertainty. I mean, I think, I work mostly in North America, and, talking with people, the number of times, people have asked me about, are you worried about vampire bats? And it's like, well, no, because they don't live here.
Well, I was going to ask you, some of the bigger myths that people believe about bats, that you kind of helped to correct in your book, and that's actually one of them is a vampire bat, and just exactly what they do and what they are. I think the other one you just mentioned, actually, another thing is the myth about the crops, because people think that bats, and farmers and stuff think bats are going to destroy their crops, when in actuality they're actually helping the farmers because they eat the insects.
Yep, eat the insects. A lot of bats, particularly in tropical regions, are very important pollinators and important seed dispersers. A lot of it's hard to, and that's some of the challenges, especially for some of the flying foxes, is sort of unlinking kind of, that it's not the flying foxes that are causing damage, it's, XYZ issues. And these issues are very complicated, and so working with these communities to sort of, and this is true across across the world, like working with people who are living and coexisting with these animals, and sort of figuring out how to do that is key. And a lot of it just comes down to, it's, because they're so mysterious, it's really easy for, these myths to pop up, and it can be really hard to counter that.
Well, exactly, like the vampire bat. They don't go around sucking people's blood. That does not happen. Now they do from animals, though. That's what they feed off of, but they don't go around sucking people's blood like you see in the movies and stuff like that.
No, yeah, and they are only found in Central and South America. If you are anywhere else in the world, you don't need to worry about encountering a vampire bat. And actually, I always think it's interesting because, and you did mention sort of Dracula, and the idea, right, that these vampires turn into bats. And my understanding is that myth sort of started with Bram Stoker's Dracula, and he got the inspiration when European explorers were sending back reports about these giant, and I'm saying giant in sort of quotes, giant blood-sucking bats. And so that, of course, is like, which came first. Sort of the vampire bats were sort of described by, two Europeans first, and then that's where we link them to vampires, like, as the monster, which I just think is sort of interesting, like the way humans, sort of the way we integrate, what we're learning about into our stories and our, folklore and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Well, and then,
which came first.
Right, exactly. We're even bringing our kids up with that when you look at, at least, like Hotel Transylvania and stuff, at least they've made Dracula and them a little bit nicer. So, and not the blood-sucking things that, they're nice. They're nice. Yeah. So, it's funny, though, like you said, how we turn that into that kind of stuff. So, so one thing, though, that has been happening and that I was reading about in your book was the white nose syndrome that has devastated some bat populations and is continuing to devastate bat populations. So, what can you explain a little bit more about what white nose syndrome is and what it's doing to the bat populations and the hopes you guys have that for bat conservation efforts in that respect?
So white nose syndrome is this fungal disease that impacts hibernating bats in mostly temperate systems, so places like North America, and then we sometimes see it maybe in Europe. And it's caused by this. It's essentially a soil fungus. It lives in the dirt in caves, and it's called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which is a mouthful. So we sometimes call it just PD for short. And basically, what happens is when bats go into caves to hibernate, they are, they're turning off the furnace. They're shutting down, all non-essential body functions. They slow down their heart rates. They slow down their temperature. They lower their temperatures. They slow down their breathing. And they also, sort of hit the pause button on things like immune response. And so this fungus is then able to, when it gets on the bat's skin, it's a type of fungus that grows on tissue, and it essentially hijacks that, physiology and starts growing on their wing skin, and then on their noses, which is where the name comes from, and then on their ears. And what happens is the growing of this fungus basically causes bats to wake up from hibernation more frequently than they would otherwise. And if we remember that hibernation, the reason bats are doing hibernation is to save energy. They're this tiny animal. They can only pack on so much fat for a winter. And so every time they wake up, they are having to burn a bunch of that energy that they have saved. And so what ends up happening is this fungal infection disrupts their hibernation, causes them to wake up more frequently, and they burn through, these fat reserves faster than they would otherwise. And so that leads them to starve or to, wake up and try to find food before winter is over, when there's no insects out and about. So it was first discovered in 2006 in upstate New York, and has since spread to something like 35 or 36 states. Not all places have necessarily seen bats infected by the disease. So when it's actually an infection in a bat, that is when it's called white nose syndrome. Otherwise, it's just sort of these detections of that fungus in the cave environment. And it did lead to, for some of the bats that were most affected, really large population decline, something between like 85 to 99% of declines for some of these species have been linked to this disease, which is depressing. But what is sort of, what I try to hold on to as a bat scientist, as a person who's interested in conservation, and, I think hope is a really important piece of conservation that we need to hold on to, is that while there's been these huge declines, we do still see these species getting by, not in the same numbers that they used to. I, have had the pleasure to work in some of these places that white nose hit pretty hard, up in Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula. But, we were still seeing them. They're still coming back. They're still coming to hibernate. I help count bats at a local church here not far from where I live in Pennsylvania. And the past few years, the little brown bats, which was one of the species that were hit particularly hard, they're not at the, several thousand that they used to be at, but they've been holding steady, which is something. And there's definitely hope that, the bats that are surviving, that maybe that they have some genetic variation that makes them more likely to survive. A lot of in the spaces that I have worked in, some of the shift has gone from, how do we, prevent or clean up these fungus, which is a very difficult task, to more of how can we support the populations that are surviving. Mm-hmm. What can we do to, these bats, we know that they're having to go in, they're dealing with this challenge every winter. How can we make the rest of their lives easier?
Right.
Right. So things like supporting, native plant populations that are going to support native insects and provide food for these bats, make it easier for them to get as fat as possible before hibernation, providing important, habitat both before hibernation, over the summer, right? All the points of the life cycle. So there's definitely a multi-pronged approach for, how can we best support these bat populations and sort of continue to try to figure out exactly what's going on. We're always learning new things. I think, since the book was published, a paper came out that actually showed that the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, there's actually maybe 2 species of the fungus. So there's even, we're still learning more stuff about what's going on and how this works and how we can, support bats.
Right.
In these trying times.
Wow. So is that some of this stuff the same thing that ordinary people can help to do to protect bats in their own communities? I mean, maybe putting out, bat habitats, or trying to help ensure, the plants and stuff like that in their communities where the bats may be, having that kind of stuff around to help out as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, one thing I will always advocate for, because it helps not just bats, but helps lots of, native wildlife, is, having native gardens, having native yards, having a variety of plants and structure to, your garden as much as you can, within whatever constraints you have of your, backyard size, etc. Things like, if you can leave dead leaves, if you can leave tree snags, If they're in places where it's not going to be unsafe, those types of places can be really important habitat for bats and for lots of other, native wildlife. I think people always ask about bat houses, which I think can be a great thing, particularly, if you have bats in an area where we don't want them. We don't want to just kick them out and give them nowhere to go. And so bat houses can be a great way to sort of mitigate when we have to kind of coexist with bats. Just making sure that I try to encourage people to, do their research, make sure they, have an idea of what species of bat they might have in their area. Different bats like different, living habitats. So some bats like it really hot, some bats like it cooler, some bats like lots of space so they can cram themselves and 1,000 of their best friends into one spot. Some bats prefer to, have solo apartments. So just kind of knowing, what's in your area can be really helpful if people are interested in bat houses. And then honestly, just, we've talked a lot about sort of bat myths and bat, misconceptions. And I think just sort of, spreading the good word about why bats are important and sort of, their role in our environment. And, they deserve to live and be in spaces as well. And, making it so that we can safely coexist with them as much as possible goes a long way. So.
Right. Well, yeah, exactly. Now, another thing that you mentioned in the books, in the book, was about bats having a unique immune system. What do you think studying bats could teach us about human health?
Yeah, so this is a much newer area of kind of research, I think, especially as we learn more about and have more access to a lot of genetic tools. But we do know that bats, have these really robust immune systems. They can sort of coexist without, necessarily experiencing side effects from a wide range of different types of viruses and bacteria. We think some of that might be linked to their ability to fly. So one of the hypotheses out there about why bats are so good at this is this flight as fever. So fever, when we get sick, having a fever is our body's way of trying to fight off infection. And bats, they are pretty much always operating at these higher temperatures, which are much harder for bacteria and for these pathogens to survive at. There's just so many different types of bats that they probably all have slightly different variations in the way that they're able to deal with infection. One thing that I think has come out in the last few years, and another hypothesis, is that So when we get sick, when people or humans get sick, a lot of the damage that happens to us when we are sick is actually not from the pathogen itself, but it's from our body's attempt to fight off the pathogen. So things like inflammation, where we actually, our own cells end up causing damage to ourselves. Bats have ways that their cells and different cell pathways sort of circumvent some of those inflammatory things, so they are able to sort of be more targeted potentially in the way that they fight off pathogens without necessarily having negative effects on themselves. So understanding sort of how these pathways work, if there's certain molecules or things that are happening that set off these pathways, I think there's some hope that we can sort of co-opt those ideas to develop, drug treatments or things like that. Kind of as a biomimicry sort of approach is one thing that I think people are hoping. It's also true for not just immune response, but also aging and longevity.
Mm-hmm.
Bats live exceptionally long lives for their body size. And so there's a lot of research looking into, what's going on at the cellular level that's making it so that they, as their cells divide, they don't break down at these certain rates, or what sort of cellular pathways are minimizing the effect of aging on cells, and how can we learn from those and take advantage of those to apply them in certain circumstances.
Right. So what do you think is next for you in your research or your writing? Do you have any plans for another book or researching more on a particular bat species, or what's up next?
Yeah, so I've actually, I will be starting in a couple weeks as a professor at a small liberal arts college here in Pennsylvania. So I'll be looking to doing a lot more teaching and diving back into doing hopefully some field work, exploring some more local bats and looking at how they react to olfactory cues in their environments. And then I continue to write. I guest write for Bat Conservation International's blog, and maybe give me another 10 years, and I'm sure we'll have enough material to write a whole new bat book with all the things that will have been learned since the first one.
Exactly, because research keeps getting done, so there's got to be new stuff out there. Well, as long as you're including those beautiful photographs again, because I'm telling you, those really made a difference with the book, because they were just gorgeous. I loved looking at them. So,
I am eternally grateful to, particularly to Brock Fenton and Sherry Fenton, and then Price Sewell, who donated a lot of those photos that are just stunning, beautiful photography of bats that really capture the personality that we see.
Exactly. Now, if somebody wanted to learn more about you, or if they would like to get your book, The Weird and Wonderful World of Bats, where can they find more information about you, and where can they find your book? Or can both be found on the same site?
A little bit of both. So I have, my website is AlysonBrokaw.com, and I'm also active on social media, particularly Instagram and TikTok, as AllyB_Batgirl, where I share a lot of fun videos and things about bats. I believe all those places have links to the book, but I like to encourage people pretty much everywhere books are sold. But one of my favorite places to buy books is bookshop.org, where you can select a local or independent bookstore to benefit from your purchases while still getting to the benefit of buying online.
Oh, nice. Well, Alyson, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast tonight and sharing all this information about bats. I hope the listeners out there found it as informational as I did. I love learning, about new things and stuff like that. So it was great having you on to talk about bats and dispel some of the myths and misunderstandings about them.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. I could talk about bats for hours, so getting me to shut up, that's the harder part.
Well, if new research and stuff comes out, maybe we'll have to see about having you on again at a later time, in a few years, and discuss some of the new stuff about bats.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, again, I appreciate you being on the podcast tonight. I'm just going to go ahead and announce my next couple of podcasts that'll be coming up next month. You're welcome to stay on while I do that, but I also know, different time zone, you're a little bit later, so you are also welcome to jump off while I announce those. That's perfectly fine. So, and again, I appreciate you being on tonight. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll go ahead and hop off, but have a good rest of your night.
All right. Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
All right. Bye now. All right, everybody. So Alyson just got off. It was great talking with her about bats and learning all that information that she shared with us. And again, guys, don't forget, if you want to learn more about bats, go on out there and buy Alyson's book and give it a read. There's a lot of good information in there, and like I said, those photographs are just stunning. So kudos for those guys that took them and donated those pictures. All right, so the next upcoming podcasts, I think you guys are going to like the next one. It's on August 7th, and I'm going to have Erin Manley, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing her name correct, or his name, on They're with Pet Partners. They are going to be coming on to talk with me about Pet Partners, which is a therapy or service dog organization. And one of the things they're coming on to talk about is the Pet Partners World's Largest Pet Walk, which is going to be happening on Saturday, September 27th. So we're going to be talking about that, and we're also going to be talking about pet partners and their love of pet therapy animals. It's just therapy, not service. And how, you can volunteer with your pet, become a pet partner, therapy animal volunteer, how you can help support their mission, request visits from pets to go to nursing homes, things like that, hospitals, all sorts of information about pet partners that we'll be finding out. So I am looking forward to having Erin coming on the show. And then on August 21st, I'm going to have Tanya from Turpentine Creek Sanctuary. I'm pretty sure Tanya is the founder of the sanctuary. She'll be coming on to talk with me about Turpentine Creek, which is a big cat sanctuary for like the cats that are being sold and traded in the exotic animal trade, and the ones used in the movies and stuff like that. So they are a sanctuary where a lot of these big cats can go, and they are helping to educate the public, and they're trying to end the exotic animal trade, and they're doing a lot of great stuff, education, preservation, all sorts of good stuff. They do rescue, some animal care, helping out with enforcement, stuff like that. So they are also helping bears as well. So Tanya's going to be coming on, and she's going to be telling us all about Turpentine Creek Wildlife Sanctuary, Wildlife Refuge. So I'm looking forward to talking with her. Yes, Tanya is president founder. So I'm looking forward to having her on. It's going to be really good to talk with her about the cats and stuff like that. So again, guys, don't forget to come on back in a couple weeks and join me on August 7th for the Pet Partners, and then on August 21st for the Turpentine Creek Animal Refuge, and learn a little bit more about those two organizations and the animals and stuff. So I hope you guys enjoyed tonight's podcast, and I hope you guys learned a lot, and I hope you all stay safe out there this weekend, and don't be getting into too much trouble. And excuse my dog down here for whining. I think his people are coming out. So anyway, you all have a good weekend, and stay safe out there, and come on back in a couple weeks for the next podcast. All right, bye now.